I know that I've mentioned to you before that very often on Mondays I spend a good part of the day at the zoo. And I usually spend most of my time there sitting at my table, drinking a cup of coffee, preparing for the week, answering emails. If I'm speaking the next Sunday, I try and put some thought and prayer into what I'm speaking on. But I also spend some time enjoying what the zoo has to offer. One of my favorite animals that I used to have, he passed away about a year ago, was their ocelot. Now, ocelots are these smaller wild cats. I don't know if you've ever seen them before, but they're smaller wild cats that live in certain parts of South America, particularly around Argentina. And in the wild, their life expectancy is typically between 11 and 12 years. But this guy happened to have been 22 years old when he passed away, so he was old. And although you can tell even by the way that he was walking, he was battling many of the same things that we tend to battle when we get older. He had arthritis and he had some issues with his muscles and his bones, but he also had a cataract in his eye. And you can see that in one of those pictures, that the lens in his eye was particularly cloudy. Some of us have had that same issue, haven't we? I had a cataract removed a few years ago, and I'll save you all the gory details about how they do it. But literally, they do remove a cloudy part of the lens in your eye, and then they replace it with a brand new, clearer one. For those of you who have had this procedure done, then you know it's incredible just how much of a difference it makes to your seeing once that part of the lens is replaced. Colors look brighter, details look sharper, and it becomes so much easier to drive at night. I know that was one of the big issues that I had. I just couldn't drive at night anymore when I had my cataract. I first realized that I was having problems with my eyes when I couldn't read the font size on my sermon notes. And I started with a 12-point font, then I moved up to a 14, then I moved up to a 16-point font, bumped that up to an 18, but by the time I hit a 20-point font, I figured that there was something wrong. And my problem, it really was a very easy problem to fix. But when you're dealing with your eyes, there oftentimes isn't an easy solution. Monica's grandpa passed away in 2016 when he was 103 years old. And I believe that this picture that you're looking at was at his 102nd birthday party. And he had dealt with macular degeneration for the final 20 years of his life. I remember having a number of chats with him about how difficult that must have been for him as his eyesight slowly over a period of 20 years deteriorated until finally his vision was reduced to next to nothing. The story that we're going to look at this morning is the story of a man who was born blind. He had never seen a sunrise. He had never set eyes on his family. And because of the culture that he lived in, he was destined for a life of begging and living off the generosity of others. And this is his story from John chapter 9. Watch this.
As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming, when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed. And came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said.
And you and I, who can see, have no idea what it must have been like to never have been able to see. But that was this man's story. I mean, he didn't know any better. He was a man who had lived his entire life up to this point in a dark world. He was a man who we know had been blind since birth, and that was his life. That's what a normal day looked like to him. Until one day, all of that changed. This morning, we're going to work our way through John chapter 9. And our text is going to be the entire chapter, although we're not going to stop and read every verse. But just before we jump into that, let me give you a brief snapshot of what Jesus had just experienced one day prior to this healing. Because just before the incident that we're about to read, Jesus had had quite a day. In John chapter 8, Jesus had just had a run-in with the Pharisees and with the woman caught in adultery. I mean, remember that story? And he said to this woman, and right in front of the Pharisees who had the rocks in their hands and were ready to stone her, he said, "Who is there to condemn you?" He had also, just a day before, claimed right in front of the Pharisees and the religious leaders to be the light of the world, and that angered them to the point where we're told that they wanted to stone him too. So what we need to understand here is that things between Jesus and the religious community and the Pharisees are already very tense. And with that having just happened, Jesus walks into this encounter. Jesus and his disciples are walking through Jerusalem on their way out of the temple area when John 9 opens with this. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now, I'll admit that that might sound like a bit of an odd question to ask Jesus, but back then, the Jewish religious leaders believed, and they taught, that good things happened to good people because God was favoring them, and bad things happened to bad people because God was, for some reason, punishing them. They believed in something similar, not exactly the same as, but something similar to what we would call karma. They believed that what goes around comes around. They believed that you reap what you sow. But the Jewish community also believed that a person's sin could be foreseen by God. In other words, a person could be born into a particular sin And God could and would punish people for the sins that they hadn't yet committed yet. And that's what was ingrained into the disciples' thinking as well as to the general Jewish community. So this story actually starts off with finger pointing. The disciples are pointing their finger at this blind man and asking, who sinned and caused this man's blindness? Was it his fault or was it his parents' fault? Do you know, almost from the very beginning of time, people have been trying to answer that question, haven't they? Why do bad things happen that cause suffering in this world? And Jesus is about to tackle that issue head on. He goes on to tell his disciples that this man's blindness, it had nothing to do with some sin in this man's life or in his parents' life. God is not punishing him. God is not angry with them, and that's not why bad things happen in the world. In fact, Jesus says in verse 3, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Just think about that. Where the disciples were looking at this guy and asking, who's to blame for the condition that he finds himself in? Jesus is trying to help them understand how God views this man. You know, the more I study the Gospels and the teachings of Jesus, the more I'm convinced that Jesus spends most of his time combating the way the religious community, and I'll throw the disciples into that as well, how they see people and how they perceive our human condition to be. I mean, they would see people through the eyes of judgment and condemnation and make the assumption that that must be the way God sees people too. They see people through the eyes of the law, where Jesus has been showing them a new way, a way that's better than the law. And it's almost as if the disciples and the religious community in this story, that they had some kind of a spiritual blind spot in their vision. So Jesus, he confronts his disciples with one of their blind spots. And as he's doing that, he starts to prepare them for something else that is about to happen. And in verse 4, this is what Jesus says. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, he says, I am the light of the world. Back in these days, blind people were often referred to as people living in darkness. Darkness because these people's eyes, they couldn't process light. But there's a more subtle assumption in here as well. Because the blind were often referred to as people of darkness because of perceived sin that they or their parents must have committed, they thought. And that line of thinking led to the attitude that said, really, you shouldn't feel bad for them. You shouldn't take pity on them. When they beg, you really shouldn't help them out because they're only getting what they deserve. And I wondered as I was preparing for today, I wonder if we have any spiritual blind spots in our own lives. You know, areas where our thinking and areas of our way of looking at people maybe don't line up with the way God's does. When you see somebody suffering, you're ever guilty of saying, I wonder what they did to deserve that? Or what about if you are suffering? You ever ask yourself, I wonder what God is punishing me for? But in this passage, Jesus reminds us why sometimes bad things happen to good people. He says so that the work of God might be displayed in a person's life. So sometimes God allows bad things to happen so that his glory can be revealed. He's also telling his disciples in these verses that he is the one who has been called and preordained and intentionally sent by God the Father so that a special kind of light will be brought into the world, a kind of light that they didn't yet understand. So in this passage, he's giving them a glimpse as to the purpose behind suffering, but he also sheds light on who God is and how a person can find freedom from a very different kind of blindness. So Jesus now proceeds to bring this man who has spent his entire life in a physical darkness into the light. And starting in verse 6, this is what it says. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back sleeping. Now, kind of curious, don't you think? A curious thing for Jesus to do. I mean, Jesus could have just snapped his fingers and the man would have been healed, right? Jesus could have, once again, just simply said the words and watched as this man's life was transformed as he could see for the first time. But no, that's not what Jesus did. Jesus said to the paralyzed man earlier on in the gospel, he simply said, "Take up your mat and walk." But that's not what Jesus did here. So why the spit? Why make the mud? And why tell the man to go to the pool and wash? And I want to suggest to you there's two significant things happening here behind the scenes. Remember that this story is being played out in front of a crowd, and it's being played out and witnessed by the religious community as well. So firstly, it's important to note that we find out later on in this story that this miracle took place on the Sabbath. And as we know, the religious community, they had set up these rules to govern what the spiritual in-crowd was able to do and not do on the Sabbath, all in an attempt to prevent God's chosen people from doing something that in their minds would be displeasing to God. So the fourth commandment reads like this. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work." And so the religious leaders had actually gone ahead and set up more than 600 different rules to define what labor and work on the Sabbath was and what it wasn't. And it just so happened that one of those things spelled out very clearly was related to bending down and working with mud. And you can just see Jesus almost in a rebellious defiance of what the religious community had turned faith in God into. He spits on the ground, makes mud with his saliva, and he puts it on this guy's eyes. But the second thing that I want to point out that is also very symbolic is that Jesus told this man to go to the pool of Siloam. This was a specially designed pool that was used for ceremonial drinking and cleansing. So why did Jesus send him to that pool? Well, for starters, because this man was blind and because it was believed that he was blind because of sin, understand that he would have been considered unclean, and those waters were not even available for him to use. In fact, as an unclean man washing in these ceremonial waters, he would have made the water in that pool ceremonially unclean. And that would have sent the poor religious community into a tailspin as to what to do. So I'm wondering if you can see the irony here. It was through his obedience to listening to Jesus and washing in this ceremonial water that he wouldn't even have been permitted by the Jews to use, that he was healed. And it was through the washing in that cleansing ceremonial water that he received his sight. At this point in the story, we see Jesus and his disciples, they step away. And the man's now confronted by the Pharisees and people who had known him before he had gained his sight. So in verses 8, we're told this. We're told that his neighbors were curious and they asked. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as the beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he looks like him, but he is like him." He kept saying, "I'm the man." So he's giving testimony and saying, "Yes, I'm the guy. I was that guy you knew." Verse 10, so they said to him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and I washed and I received my sight." We then see that the Pharisees step in verse 13, and this is what happens next. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now, it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." So understand this. The Pharisees' argument was this: he healed on the Sabbath, which is against our law. He bent down and worked with mud on the Sabbath, which is against our law. He told this unclean man to wash in our ceremonial water, which is against our law. So how could he possibly be? How could he be from God? In other words, if Jesus is doing something that contradicts what we think God should do, then how can he be from God? So they tell this man who had been healed that Jesus cannot possibly be from God because he broke their religious law. And some people start to question that, and we're told, how can this man be a sinner and do such signs? But it gets even more crazy because these religious leaders are not hearing what they want from this man. So they sent for his parents. As I read through this, I remembered a time in high school when I did something I shouldn't have, and the school called for my parents. And I wonder if that's somehow what this man was feeling in that moment. I mean, can you imagine that? They sent for his parents and start giving them the third degree, and they reply with this, starting in verse 20. His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself." And there's a very interesting little caveat that starts in verse 22 here, where it says his parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. And this blind man's parents, they were scared. They were afraid of these powerful religious leaders. And they were threatened by the fact that their son had been healed. I mean, his healing was rocking the boat and threatening their way of life. And you get the impression that this blind man's parents were not on board with the changes that this was making for them. Well, not hearing what they wanted from his parents, they call the man back, and it breaks into this all-out war of words. And you have to love this man's total brutal honesty at this point. He says, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." And this guy, he has nothing to hide, does he? He didn't understand the theology behind what had just happened to him. And truthfully, he didn't even fully understand who Jesus was. But there was one thing he understood. He had been blind, and now he could see. This man could see, and we begin to understand that the people with the real blind spots were who? The religious leaders. I mean, sure, they may have had good physical eyes, but don't be fooled. They were blind. In verse 26, they say to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? Tell us. We want to know. We need to know." And in verse 28, we're told that they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." And then in verse 30, the blind man who could now see corrects the seeing men who were proving their own blindness. He says this. He says, why this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And likely completely exhausted from all of this back and forth, they answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us?" And we're told that they cast him out. Do you know, this really is a story of two different types of blindness, isn't it? You know, one is of the man who was born with a physical defect in his eyes. But the second is of a group of people who had a spiritual defect. And they just couldn't comprehend that God doesn't always fit into the nice, neat box that they had tried to stuff him into. In some ways, this story even tells us that spiritual blindness is worse than physical blindness, because physical blindness can at least be healed. And I wonder, anybody here this morning struggling with that same spiritual birth defect? Anybody battling a spiritual blind spot? A spiritual blind spot is the inability to see that God is using something imperfect to accomplish his perfect plan. It's the inability to see when and where God is really working. It's the inability to see Jesus for who he really is. And that's why the Pharisees were being so stubborn. That's why people today are so stubborn. These blind spots are spiritual birth defects, and we all have a tendency to have them. But I just love the way this passage ends, starting in verse 35, because we find that Jesus is stepping back into the conversation and into the relationship with this man. And we find that he's about to heal him again, now of his spiritual blindness. And rather than me reading this and having you follow along on the screen, I'm going to invite you just to close your eyes where you are, and I want you to listen to what Jesus is doing here. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and he is the one speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, and those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. And this man not only saw with physical eyes, but now he was seeing with spiritual eyes as well. And I'm reminded of the passage in Ezekiel 12 where it was prophesied that there would be those who have eyes to see but do not see, and ears to hear but do not hear, for they are a rebellious people. For all their knowledge of the scripture and religious practice, the religious community who really thought that they were the ones that knew better were completely missing the point. And they thought that their academic knowledge and their relentlessness in following the lists of do's and don'ts in the law and the hours and hours of study, they thought that within all of those things, that's how you find favor with God. When what God really wanted was for them to simply open their eyes and to see. You know, when you have a spiritual blind spot, God can be doing something incredible right in front of you, and you still don't see it. And this passage reveals for us 4 specific blind spots. The disciples were blinded by judgment. They said, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? The neighbors were blinded by skepticism. He's the one who was born blind. He couldn't be. It's just someone that looks like him. The parents were blinded by fear, afraid of what the people around them might think. And the Pharisees were blinded by their religion. The Pharisees should have been the first ones jumping for joy that this blind man who had been blind since birth could now see. But they were blinded because they couldn't comprehend that God can work in a way that was outside of that box that they had stuffed him into. Charles Spurgeon once said, it's not our littleness that hinders Christ, it's our bigness. It's not our weakness that hinders Christ, it's our strength. It's not our darkness that hinders Christ, but it's our supposed light that holds back his hand. Do you know, my friends, no matter who you are, no matter your theological training, no matter your years of experience at being a religious person, everyone is susceptible to a blind spot. When you have a blind spot that you're unwilling to keep in check, then you might just miss out on what God is doing right there in your midst. I want to close this morning with a question that the Pharisees asked Jesus in verse 40. And I think it's a question that we all have to prayerfully consider as well. They asked Jesus, they said, are we blind too? My prayer is that the Lord would reveal to each and every one of us our own blind spots, should we have them. Let's pray. Jesus, this is such a beautiful story. It's very difficult for any of us to really understand what life must have been like for that individual who had been blind since birth, never having seen any of those things that we take for granted. And what a beautiful thing, Lord. What a beautiful thing that you restored his sight. But there's also a lot that we can learn from those people around him. And I ask, Lord, that you would, even in these moments, convict us if there is a blind spot in our hearts and in our lives. Maybe it's a judgment that we have passed on to somebody we know. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's a family member. I ask, Lord, that you would convict us of this blind spot, that you would reveal it to us. And I ask that you would help us to accept your gift of having that blind spot removed. We love you, Lord. In your name we pray.